Hey guys! Tonight we drift far from the noise of modern cities and into the quiet dust of a forgotten past. first glance, it was just another artifact of the age of exploration. But something about this map, its contours, its coastlines, begged further scrutiny, particularly in the southernmost corner, where no ships had yet sailed, and no man had set foot in recorded history. There, drawn in meticulous detail, was the northern coast of Antarctica, free of ice. The Piri Reis map became an anomaly in cartographic circles, then a scandal, and finally, a whisper passed between those who question official timelines. Because Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years later. And even then, it was cloaked entirely in ice. But the Piri Reis map doesn't show Antarctica as we know it. It shows the landmass as it would appear without its ice cap, with rivers, mountain ranges, valleys, details that wouldn't be known until the advent of seismic surveys and ground-penetrating radar in the 20th century. How could a map from the early 1500s depict what even modern satellites struggle to confirm? Some scholars dismiss the anomaly, suggesting the southern coast may simply represent an elongated rendering of South America. But this doesn't hold. The curvature, the scale, the precision of the coastal geography, none of it aligns with known 16th century knowledge. Then the theory shifted. Maybe Piri Reis hadn't drawn the original data. Maybe he'd copied it. In the surviving annotations along the map's edge, the admiral himself confesses. Much of the map's source material came from ancient sea charts, salvaged from unknown origins. He attributes some of it to maps from the Library of Alexandria, already gone for over 1,000 years at that point. Others, he says, came from even older sources. And this is where the real question begins. If ancient maps were capable of showing an ice-free Antarctica, then who made those maps and when? Geological records suggest the last time the Antarctic coast was ice-free was at least 6,000 years ago, possibly as long as 12,000. In other words, long before Sumer, long before agriculture, long before any known seafaring culture. Some fringe researchers have suggested that the continent was mapped by an advanced pre-Ice Age civilization, one that had mastered not only maritime travel, but geodesy, the science of measuring and understanding Earth's geometry. That knowledge would have required complex instruments, mathematics, a worldview beyond mere survival. This isn't an isolated incident. Other ancient maps, like the Orontius Phineus map and the Buachi map, also depict similar coastlines, suggesting a common ancestral source, a lost archive of global knowledge. The idea of an ancient civilization with a grasp of planetary cartography seems fantastical, until one considers how much has been lost. Great fires, conquests, tsunamis, tectonic shifts. How many libraries have been reduced to ash? How many vaults lie beneath silt and salt water, unreachable? And what if these maps weren't entirely human? In almost every ancient culture, there are tales of sky beings, serpent gods, watchers, shining ones, who descended to impart knowledge. In Sumer, they were the Apkallu. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl. In Egypt, Thoth, always associated with wisdom, astronomy, and maps. Is it possible that these beings, real or mythic, left behind blueprints of the Earth as it was? Long before the ice, long before memory? Mainstream scholars dismiss twin lions of Mesopotamia, the solar discs of Egypt, the coiled serpent of Mesoamerica, echoes of a shared story, fractured by distance and time. If Göbekli Tepe is the memory of a lost civilization, then what came before it? Where did the builders learn their geometry, their celestial knowledge? And why did they seem to fear what the stars could bring? These questions remain unanswered. The site is still being excavated. Less than 10% of it has been uncovered. What lies beneath the remaining mounds may change everything. But one thing is already clear. The story of human civilization does not begin in Sumer. It does not rise in a straight line. It folds, it breaks, it starts, and then restarts. And somewhere between the folds, beneath the weight of buried stone, waits a memory we were never supposed to unearth.
Across cultures, continents, and millennia, a single story echoes like a drumbeat beneath human memory, the story of the flood. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving texts, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by the Gaudia of a coming deluge. He builds a vast boat, preserves animals and seed, and survives a cataclysm that drowns the world. Sound familiar? Centuries later, the book of Genesis echoes the same tale. Noah the ark, the animals 2 by 2. But the similarities don't stop there. In India, the Mahabharata tells of Manu, a righteous man saved by a giant fish who warns him of an oceanic catastrophe. In China, there is Nuwa, who repairs the broken sky after a flood drowns the land. In Mesoamerican myth, a previous age ends when the gods destroy the world in water. From Norse sagas to Aboriginal Dreamtime, the same motif repeats. A flood, a warning, a remnant spared. What makes this significant isn't the symbolism, it's the convergence. These cultures had no known contact, no trade routes, no shared language. Yet all recall a time when the world ended in water. Mainstream historians view these stories as metaphors, moral or spiritual allegories representing rebirth, punishment, or cyclical time. But what if they're not symbolic? What if they're historical? Geological records support a major cataclysm at the end of the Younger Dryas, around 11,600 years ago. A sudden warming phase triggered the collapse of massive ice sheets. Sea levels surged, coastlines vanished. This event, known as Meltwater Pulse 1b, raised global ocean levels by up to 50 feet, possibly in just a few centuries or even less. Some scientists now propose the rise was not gradual, but sudden, caused by glacial dam ruptures or even cometary impacts. The evidence is physical. Underwater structures off the coast of India, like those at Dwarka, lie submerged in patterns too precise for nature. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni monument shows stepped platforms and right-angled walls, still debated, but difficult to dismiss outright. Even in the Mediterranean, at Bimini in the Bahamas, and off Cuba's western coast, sonar scans have revealed rectilinear patterns beneath the waves. Are they natural formations? Or the ruins of civilizations lost when the sea reclaimed the land? In Mesopotamia, ancient clay tablets describe the flood not as a local myth, but as an administrative disruption. One Sumerian text divides kings into two categories: those who ruled before the flood, and those who ruled after. The pre-flood kings are said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years. This isn't how people usually record metaphors.
incredible speed. He never elaborated. The fringe theories emerged quickly. Some claim remnants of an ancient civilization lie buried beneath the ice, perhaps Atlantean, perhaps something older. Others suggest that Antarctica was once home to the first world, destroyed in the global cataclysm and flash frozen in place. Plato wrote that Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules and disappeared beneath the sea in a single day and night of destruction. But he never specified latitude, only isolation, only mystery. Is it so inconceivable that survivors of an advanced culture fled rising seas and plunging temperatures, and that one of those cultures settled at the world's edge, where the cold came last? Even today, Antarctica is an international enigma. No nation owns it. No cities occupy it. No mining, military operations, or sovereignty claims are permitted under the Antarctic Treaty System. The continent is off limits to all but the most carefully monitored scientific missions. Why? Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it's expensive. But the deeper question remains, what's under there? What secrets were buried not by intention, but by time itself? And if there is something human, or post-human, frozen under that ice, how long has it been waiting? In the late 1990s, strange radio signals were detected emanating from the ice. Known as ice quakes, these bursts of energy defied explanation. They weren't seismic. They weren't magnetic. They were rhythmic, like a pulse, like a signal trying to be heard. What happens if the ice melts? Sea levels rise, coastal cities drown. But more than that, memory returns. Land re-emerges. Structures come back into view. Perhaps this is why myths warn of the ice melting again. In Hopi legend, the previous world ended in water, and the next will end in fire. The Maya spoke of the fifth sun, destined to collapse like the four before it. In every ancient narrative, there is an understanding. Earth resets. Again and again. Antarctica may not just be the end of the world. It may be the beginning. But beginnings require endings. And if the great cataclysm buried more than forests and cities, if it buried knowledge, bloodlines, and memory, then digging into Antarctica isn't just an excavation. It's an unsealing, a thawing, and once something is thawed, it wakes. History is a brittle thing. It survives not because it's true, but because it was written, copied, and kept safe. Yet time, conquest, and fear have a habit of reducing memory to smoke. Across every continent, in every age, fire has consumed more knowledge than it has ever revealed. And sometimes, it feels deliberate. The most famous example, of course, is the Library of Alexandria. A beacon of learning in the ancient world, it once held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, maps, histories, astronomical charts, treatises on medicine and machines. Its destruction remains a point of debate. Was it Caesar's fire, a Christian purge, an Arab conquest, or all three, each flame licking away what remained of the world before? We will never know what was lost. But what's most unsettling is not that the library burned, but that it burned more than once. Like someone kept coming back to make sure. Alexandria wasn't alone. In Heliopolis, the House of Life, one of the oldest Egyptian temple complexes, held records said to stretch back to the time of the gods. Gone. In Nineveh, the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal preserved Sumerian texts Serpent symbolism appears in nearly every advanced ancient society. In China, the dragon. In India, the naga. In West Africa, the rainbow serpent. In the Amazon, the boa who whispered creation. In Norse myth, Jörmungandr, the world-encircling snake. In most cases, the serpent is not evil, but wise. It slithers between worlds, a creature of earth and air, death and rebirth. And in many cultures, the serpent is associated with knowledge forbidden to man. Could this imagery have encoded a deeper truth? Could the serpent gods of ancient myth have been real beings, visitors from another realm or civilization, who shaped the post-cataclysmic world? The idea is blasphemous to some, but the evidence isn't in belief, it's in continuity. Consider this. How did cultures on opposite sides of the world, with no known contact, describe nearly identical stories of arrival? Why do their origin myths include beings who descend from the heavens, not metaphorically, but physically? Why are these beings always tied to sudden leaps in human development? More importantly, where did they go? Fringe theorists like Zecharia Sitchin propose that these were extraterrestrial visitors, the famed ancient astronauts. Critics argue there's no hard proof. But what if these star people were not aliens, but remnants of a previous global civilization? One so technologically advanced that it seemed supernatural to scattered post-cataclysm survivors. What if they didn't come down from the stars, but from the high cities that once crowned the world before they fell into the sea? Consider the Dogon people of Mali. For centuries, their oral tradition described a binary star system, Sirius A and Sirius B, long before Sirius B was officially discovered in 1862. They speak of beings called the Nomo, who came from Sirius and taught their ancestors astronomy, agriculture, and metallurgy. How did they know about a star invisible to the naked eye? Coincidence, anomaly, or inheritance? Then there's the Zuni and Hopi tribes of North America. Their creation stories speak of emergence from underground, not as metaphors, but as literal events. They were guided to the surface by ant-like beings with long limbs and black eyes. To them, these were not myths. They were memories, and in every corner of the world, similar stories echo. Beings who appeared after the flood, taught, and disappeared. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Were these sons of the serpent survivors of a vanished age? The keepers of a knowledge too dangerous to remain open? Did they walk the earth among humans to ensure a fragile species remembered just enough to begin again, but not enough to repeat the mistakes that led to collapse? Scholars debate the meaning of these stories. But one thing remains unchallenged. These figures were not passive. They were builders. In Mesoamerica, they raised pyramids. In Mesopotamia, they aligned ziggurats with stars. In Egypt, they left codes in stone, proportions that match planetary ratios. In India, the temple's spires mirrored the mountain peaks of the Himalayas. And their inner sanctums, the chambers of the human mind. What kind of intelligence could encode such universal truths? Maybe the better question is, why did they stop? At some point, the builders left. The teachers disappeared. The memory grew dim. And all that was left were myths and monuments. Perhaps they were wiped out in the same cataclysm they tried to warn us about. Or perhaps they retreated, knowing that humanity must learn again on its own. But the symbols remain: serpents, stars, spirals carved into cave walls and forgotten altars. And perhaps, if we learn to see them again, we'll understand that the past wasn't primitive. it was protected. Across the surface of the earth lie stones that should not be where they are, nor shaped the way they are. Massive, precise, impossibly old. They rise from English fields, are buried beneath Bolivian plateaus, stretch across the Andes and the Giza Plateau. They weigh hundreds of tons, yet stand perfectly aligned. And somehow, despite their age and the crude tools assumed to exist at the time, they remain unshaken by time. Consider Stonehenge in southern England. Its sarsen stones, some over 25 tons, were dragged from quarries dozens of miles away. Its blue stones came from even farther, across mountains and rivers in Wales, 150 miles to the west. No wheels, no cranes. Just ropes and ingenuity, we're told. And yet, beyond the feat of moving the stones, there's the pattern. Stonehenge is an astronomical instrument. Its axis aligns with solstices. Shadows fall perfectly along prescribed paths. The site encodes lunar cycles, solar equinoxes, and even the rare 19-year metonic cycle of the moon. But why would a Neolithic society, supposedly primitive, care about this celestial math? And how did they know? Far across the globe, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia pose an even greater puzzle. Here, at an elevation of 12,800 feet, lie stones carved with laser-like precision. Diorite blocks, second only to diamond in hardness, shaped with perfect right angles, interlocking grooves, drill holes. Archaeologists date the structures to around 500 AD. But some geologists and alternative historians argue that the foundations are far older, possibly predating the Inca by millennia. What's more, the orientation Easter Island was a religious monument. But what if they're all pieces of a forgotten language, the language of stone, meant to outlast books and paper and screen? What if the builders of the megaliths weren't trying to impress? What if they were trying to preserve? They could have encoded geometry, astronomy, geography, information needed to restart a fallen world. Instructions not for gods, but for survivors. For us.
Beneath the world's oceans lie ruins few dare to call cities. Submerged temples, carved steps descending into darkness, pillars and passageways wrapped in coral. They rest beyond the reach of most divers, cloaked in silence and silt, and with them, perhaps, the memories of civilizations lost to rising tides. In the Gulf of Kambat, off the western coast of India, sonar scans in 2001 revealed symmetrical stone formations stretching across 5 square miles of seabed. Divers recovered pottery shards, tools, and fossilized bones from a site over 120 feet below the surface. Radiocarbon dating? At least 9,500 years old, if not older. That places the ruins thousands of years before the rise of Sumer or Egypt, thousands of years before the supposed invention of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. And yet, here lay remnants of structured life, roads, rectangular buildings, and possible canals, now drowned beneath the Arabian Sea. Indian scholars called it Dwarka, echoing the legendary sunken city from Hindu texts, said to have been ruled by the god Krishna. Mainstream scientists hesitated. The data was controversial, the visibility poor, the conclusion speculative. But again, the pattern repeated. In Yonaguni, a small island south of Japan, a diver in 1986 stumbled upon what appeared to be a massive underwater monument, a stepped pyramid, sharp angles, columns, flat terraces, and paths carved into bedrock. Natural formation, said skeptics. But then came the carvings, the staircases, the uniform proportions. Geologist Masaki Kimura spent decades studying the site and concluded it was man-made, that it had been submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, over 10,000 years ago. The rebuttals were swift. Too old. Too deep. Civilization hadn't evolved that far yet. Exactly. These sites shouldn't exist. They break the timeline. They disrupt the neat model of human progress, from cave to hut to city. But what if the model is wrong? In Cuba, off the Guanahacabibes Peninsula, underwater sonar revealed symmetrical stone structures nearly 2,000 feet below the surface. Pyramidal shapes, large blocks arranged in patterns. Some claimed it was natural geology. Others suggested it could be an ancient city lost when sea levels rose rapidly 10,000 years ago. But at 2,000 feet down, the site would have been dry land over 50,000 years ago, far beyond the accepted history of organized civilization. So, which is more likely? That the structures are not man-made, or that humans have been building and losing cities far longer than we admit? Even Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, described the story of Atlantis not as myth, but as inherited knowledge from Egyptian priests. They told Solon of a mighty empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, destroyed in a single night of fire and flood. For centuries, Atlantis has been dismissed as allegory, but allegories don't come with dates. Plato gave one, 9,000 years before his time. That's 11,600 years ago, the exact end of the Younger Dryas. Coincidence or memory? Off the coast of Malta lie submerged megalithic temples older than the pyramids. In the North Sea, Doggerland, once a vast stretch of plains linking Britain to Europe, is now underwater. Archaeologists have found flint tools, mammoth bones, and evidence of human habitation, all drowned beneath what is now called the British Atlantis. We forget that most ancient humans lived near the sea. Rivers and coasts meant food, trade, shelter. But when the Ice Age ended, sea levels rose by over 400 feet. Entire civilizations, coastal, thriving, would have vanished beneath the waves, and history sank with them. Our maps show only the land we know, the land we can see. But if just 5% of the ocean floor has been explored, how much of our story lies hidden below? If cities once stood where now fish swim, who built them? What knowledge did they hold? Did they fall in an instant or sink slowly, swallowed 1 inch at a time? And how many others wait to be found? Sonar images gather dust in archives. Funding for underwater archaeology remains scarce. And when discoveries are made, they are often dismissed as natural formations, misidentified coral, or optical illusions. But the stones are there. They wait in silence. Structures without names, columns without histories, streets that lead nowhere. Because the stories that once filled them were never written down. They were lived and then lost. Perhaps the real history of human civilization doesn't lie in the deserts of Mesopotamia, but in the trenches of forgotten oceans, in cities too old to fit within textbooks, in ruins we weren't meant to remember, because remembering changes everything. It tells us we are not the first, and it begs the question, what if we're not the last?
Sometimes, the earth speaks not through fire or flood, but through absence. A silence in the soil, a missing ring in a tree's heartwood, a thin, black layer in the ice that whispers of death, not by sword, but by sky. Roughly 12,800 years ago, the earth changed overnight. Temperatures plunged, forests withered, glaciers surged forward again, despite the broader trend of warming. Species disappeared, cultures collapsed, and the sky, in some places, turned red, then black. It's called the Younger Dryas, a name as clinical as the event was catastrophic. For decades, scientists debated what caused this sudden global freeze. Some pointed to meltwater pulses disrupting ocean currents. Others blamed volcanic eruptions or shifting winds. But in the late 2000s, a new theory emerged, one that lit academic circles like wildfire: the comet hypothesis. Researchers studying the black mat layer, a strange, soot-filled stratum found across North America, began to notice anomalies. Microscopic spherules, melted glass, elevated levels of platinum, nanodiamonds. These were not the signatures of natural fires or volcanic ash. They were the fingerprints of impact, of a cosmic visitor, fragmented, burning, shattering across the sky. The theory proposed that a fragmented comet struck or exploded in the atmosphere above the North American ice sheet. The result? Instant vaporization, firestorms, atmospheric dust blocking sunlight, a nuclear winter, thousands of years before nuclear anything. Critics dismissed it. Too dramatic, too speculative. But the evidence kept appearing. In South Carolina, in Syria, in Belgium, in Greenland's ice, in the very bones of mammoths, their tusks scorched and twisted. Across 4 continents, the same layer appears, dating to the same moment in time. Something happened. And then came Hiawatha. In 2018, a team of glaciologists announced the discovery of a massive impact crater beneath Greenland's ice sheet. Over 30 kilometers wide, it had remained hidden for thousands of years. Radar scans showed the unmistakable bowl-shaped depression, suggesting a violent collision, likely within the very window of the younger Dryas. The official response? Intriguing, but unproven. The dating remains debated, but many now whisper what was once unspeakable. Earth was struck, and not just physically, culturally too. Many scholars now believe that the comet didn't just trigger environmental chaos, it reset human memory. The Clovis culture, North America's most widespread Paleo-Indian group, disappears from the archaeological records almost instantly. Elsewhere, ancient settlements went dark. Farming regressed. Art vanished. The sky changed, and so did we. If you lived in that moment, what would you remember? You'd see the stars vanish. You'd feel the earth tremble. You'd watch the forests burn and the rivers boil. You'd hear your elders whisper of gods returning in fire. You'd huddle in caves and tell your children not to look up. And in time, you'd forget the real names of the stars. Instead, you'd call them watchers, serpents, eyes of gods. You wouldn't describe an impact event. You'd tell a story of punishment, of judgment, of a flood that washed away arrogance. It's no coincidence that so many ancient texts refer to a time when the gods turned their backs, when humanity was humbled, when the world was cleansed. Not destroyed, cleansed. What if the comet didn't just end an epic, but ended a civilization, a high one? One capable of reading the sky, building structures aligned to solstices, mapping coastlines buried beneath Antarctic ice. And what if they knew it was coming? Many ancient myths describe a second sun or burning star. In Mesoamerica, the world ends in fire. In Norse myth, the sky cracks open and the wolf swallows the sun. In Zoroastrian texts, a comet-like star brings a wave of purification. Are these just archetypes or descriptions, distorted by memory? The Hopi speak of a time when the people no longer listened to the ancient ways. The sky people warned them, but they didn't heed. Then came the great purification, after which only a few were left to rebuild. Survivors, rememberers. And perhaps that's why we find megaliths so aligned, so perfect. Not built in the calm, but after the storm. Placed not in glory, but in remembrance. Markers of a sky once broken, stone testimonies carved in grief. Because when the sky goes dark and memory burns, what's left? Only what you can carve into the earth. Only what can withstand the next silence. So they built, not to rule, but to remind of a time when fire came from above and when everything we thought we knew ended. In 1901, off the coast of the Greek island Antikythera, a sponge diver stumbled upon something unexpected. Among the wreckage of a Roman cargo ship lay a corroded hunk of bronze and wood, twisted, unrecognizable. For decades, it was catalogued and largely forgotten. Just another artifact in a sea of relics. Until X-ray imaging revealed something astonishing. Gears, cogs, ratchets. Inside the massive rust was a machine, far older than any known clock, with interlocking parts designed to predict lunar phases, planetary movements, even eclipses. It became known as the Antikythera mechanism, and it shattered every assumption about the capabilities of the ancient world. Dated to around 100 BCE, it's often described as the world's first analog computer. But it's not just its existence that mystifies scholars, it's its complexity. The device contains over 30 precision gears, a differential mechanism, and inscriptions detailing its functions. Nothing of its kind would appear again for over 1,000 years. So the question is, where did it come from? Was it a one-off invention? A forgotten genius lost in time? or a surviving fragment from a lineage of technology long buried. Mainstream archaeology leans toward isolated brilliance. But there are other anomalies. Machines, instruments, and tools that seem decades or centuries out of place. Take the Baghdad battery. Discovered in Iraq, this clay jar contains a copper cylinder and an iron rod. Fill it with vinegar or citrus juice, and it produces a small electrical charge. Most date it to the Parthian period, roughly 2,000 years ago. Was it a primitive battery, a ritual object, a coincidence, or a whisper of lost electrical knowledge? In the Dendera Temple of Egypt, carved deep into the stone, is an image resembling a light bulb, complete with filaments, a power source, In other words, what if Homo sapiens isn't a clean species at all, but the product of an ancient synthesis? Ancient Sumerian texts describe humanity as being fashioned by the gods. Not created from scratch, but altered. Formed from clay, yes, but always with the addition of something divine. The book of Genesis echoes this. Man is molded from the dust, but only becomes alive when the breath of God is added. In the apocryphal book of Enoch, watchers descend from the heavens and interbreed with human women, producing the Nephilim, giants with great knowledge and strength, later wiped out by the flood. These stories are treated as metaphor, myth, symbol. But when viewed alongside the genetic anomalies, they begin to feel like memory. Distorted, yes, but rooted in something real. Today, genome researchers still stumble upon what they call endogenous retroviruses, ancient viral code embedded in our DNA, dating back millions of years. Some of these viruses are benign. Others affect fertility, immunity, even brain development. And then there are the non-coding regions, what used to be called junk DNA. For years, scientists believed these stretches did nothing. But we now know they regulate everything. Gene expression, neurological complexity, and even aging. What if some of this junk isn't junk at all, but legacy code? Instructions from a time before time. Information passed down from a civilization that encoded memory in biology. When stone tablets weren't enough. In 2017, researchers found that a rare gene variant tied to high-altitude adaptation among Tibetans originated not from Homo sapiens, but from Denisovans. How did an extinct species pass on a survival gene to humans? And how many other traits do we owe to beings whose names we'll never know? The questions multiply. Why do some isolated tribes have languages that cannot be traced to any linguistic root? Why do pyramidal structures, aligned with stars, appear across cultures with no contact? Why does every ancient culture insist knowledge was given, not discovered? And why does the human brain, so astonishingly complex, seem to have evolved in sudden leaps rather than slow progression? Some evolutionary biologists call it the Fermi paradox of biology. Why aren't there many intermediate stages between primate and human? Why the sudden explosion of art, tool use, symbolic thought? Unless we weren't alone. Unless the shaping of humanity wasn't entirely natural, but also remembered. Perhaps those visitors we met in myth, Anuna, Nomo, sky beings, serpent kings, left more than stone calendars and carved spirals. Perhaps they left something far more permanent, themselves, within us, not as lords, but as seeds. In the jungles of southern India, carved into soapstone seals barely larger than a coin, symbols remain that no one has ever read, not for lack of trying. The Indus Valley script, found at sites like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, is one of the world's oldest written systems, dating back over 4,000 years. The people who used it were advanced. Their cities had grid layouts, sewage systems, public granaries, and sophisticated trade networks. But their writing? Still a mystery. Despite decades of study, no one has definitively cracked it. Why? Because the script has no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual key, no lengthy inscriptions. Most texts are short, 3 to 5 symbols. No repetitions, no grammar, no clues to the spoken language beneath. Some scholars now question whether it was even a language at all. But if not a language, what was it? A code? A symbol system? A remnant of something older passed down and preserved in abstraction? The Indus script isn't alone. Thousands of miles away, on Easter Island, the Rapa Nui people carved glyphs onto wooden tablets using a script known as rongorongo. Spiraling, rhythmic, pictorial. But no one alive remembers how to read it. The knowledge was wiped out by colonization, disease, and forced conversions. The last known reader reportedly died in the 19th century. Like the Indus script, rongorongo has no known relatives, no context, just silence. And yet, it recurs. Symbols in both scripts bear eerie resemblance to those found elsewhere. The double spiral, BCE. The Mayan long count starts in 3114 BCE, when, according to their mythos, the gods reset humanity. The ancient Sumerian kings list their reigns before and after the flood. The Egyptian calendar aligns itself with the helical rising of Sirius, marking not an arbitrary moment, but a cosmic reset. Why? Why do so many civilizations choose to restart their clocks? Not at the beginning of everything, but at the beginning of memory. Could it be because the real year one wasn't the first year of life on Earth, but the first year after something ended? A global cataclysm, a flood, a sky event, a memory fracturing. When survivors looked around at what remained, not much perhaps, and said, "This is where we begin again." We call it prehistory because there are no books from that time. But what if there were, and they were lost, burned, buried, or encoded in ways we no longer understand? Many scholars agree civilization did not arise gradually. It exploded in Sumer, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, each with its own calendar, but each choosing a year one tied to celestial movements, to divine visitations, or to what they describe, always, as a great ending. The Hindus call these cycles yugas, long periods of time during which humanity rises, thrives, and then collapses. We are, they say, currently in the Kali Yuga, an age of forgetting, of darkness before another reset. The Greeks believed in 5 ages of man. We are in the 5th, the final, after which comes silence. The Maya encoded time in astonishing complexity, tracking not only solar years and lunar cycles, but cosmic alignment stretching across thousands of years. Their Baktunes were not just dates, they were epochs, the ending of one and the beginning of the next. And what marked the boundary between epochs? Always collapse. But collapse is not an ending, it's a clearing. In the ruins of ancient cities, archaeologists find signs of sudden abandonment. In Mohenjo-Daro, skeletons lie in the streets, hands still clutching tools. In Teotihuacan, fire scorches once sacred temples, set not by invaders, but by the people themselves, like a people trying to erase something or reset something. The idea of resetting civilization isn't new. It's foundational. Even in Christianity, the calendar centers on a rupture, the birth of Christ. Everything before is before Christ. Everything after, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. A calendar split in two by an event that redefined time. So what happened globally that made civilizations agree? Here. Now this is the moment time begins again? Could it be that what we call the start of civilization was in fact the first coherent memory after a long forgetting? A reboot after a planetary trauma? A return to counting after generations of simply surviving? Imagine a survivor culture. They remember that time used to be tracked, that stars once meant something, that certain alignments brought rain, others brought fire. So they rebuild. Not everything. Not at once, but enough to begin counting again, enough to place a marker. From here, we measure forward. We often think of progress as linear, but in the oldest myths, it's not. It's circular or spiral. Time loops, ages return. The serpent eats its tail, and every loop begins the same way, with a collapse, and then a calendar. Even today, our modern civilization rests on timekeeping that traces back to ancient Sumerian sexagesimal systems. Base 60, 60 seconds, 60 minutes. The concept of a circle divided into 360 degrees. Why 60? No one truly knows. We inherited it, preserved it, but didn't invent it. And so, when we ask ourselves, when did history begin? We're really asking, when did we last remember how to count the stars? Because every civilization doesn't just mark time, it tries to restart it, to rebuild the clock tower after the thunder, to retune the instruments after the sky goes quiet, to measure once more what was lost. And perhaps we are doing it again now, in the face of rising seas, crumbling systems, satellites watching storms that shouldn't exist. Our calendars grow more complicated, our fears more ancient. We whisper words like unprecedented, forgetting how many times the world has already turned, and we begin to count. Again, you return, finally, to where the story was supposed to begin. Sumer. The cities still sleep beneath sand and cracked brick. Uruk, Eridu, Nippur. Their names echo in clay tablets and half-buried ziggurats, in myths we recite without truly remembering. They're quiet now, bones of a civilization scholars call the first. But tonight, you look at them differently, not as the beginning, but as the continuation. The ziggurats still stand, weathered, half collapsed, but no longer monumental. They feel like echoes, not origins, replicas, not revelations. You wander through the ruins of Ur, past broken columns and scattered cylinder seals. Your mind drifts far from cuneiform. It loops backward, to spirals carved into stone in Turkey, to temples submerged off the Indian coast, to soot trapped in the Greenland ice, to a map that showed Antarctica before the snow. Sumerians told stories of the flood, of gods who rebuilt, of kings who ruled before memory. But now, standing amid their ruins, you understand. These weren't legends of their past. They were inheritances, memories not their own, but passed down. You sit near the base of a broken wall, where weeds creep through cracks that weren't soft, quiet truth. We've been here before.